Thank you. Let me just ask a quick question because frankly, I've had the opportunity to look at the legislation and have received a lot of support for it, frankly, from my district. I'm going to disagree with my friend from Michigan in one regard. I actually have Corps of Engineer land that would be great hunting land that people are just not allowed to access and not even allowed to access it in ways that traditionally they have, and then the Corps will come in after the fact and exercise jurisdiction. So whether this is the right language or not, I think we can debate, but I think it does address a real problem. You know, I am surprised, 'cause I know both of you to be, you know, very ardent enthusiasts in terms of hunting and outdoor sportsmanship. So I'm a little puzzled they're on different sides. I wish we could find more common ground. Maybe we can in the amendment process. We'll wait and see about that. But Mr. Whitman, you know, obviously you've got a lot of Democratic and Republican support from people that we don't often see together. I want to give you an opportunity to address any of Ms. Dingell's comments that you care to, and then I'll obviously give her an opportunity to respond. I want to hear a little bit more of the debate, to be frank with you.
Sure. Well, as we've worked through this bill, we've talked to folks in every sector of the outdoor sports, hunters, fishermen, organizations that represent them, to try to find that area to where there's a balance between their efforts to make sure that they have access, that the agencies that are in charge of managing the lands and the resources keep in mind the main users of that land, and make sure that there is a reasonable process to make sure that access is assured. That's what I believe these bills achieve. And we've done that, again, by reaching across a variety of different sectors. I mean, these are organizations like the Coastal Conservation Association, the Safari International Club, all of those that look at this, and they really look at making sure that we are making the right policy decisions and making sure that there's a balance between the folks that are the owners of these public pieces of property and the agencies that are set with the direction on managing those properties. That's what these bills do, is to make sure that we have that proper balance there, to make sure that sportsmen have their say in how decisions are made on these pieces of property. We all believe that that's very thoughtful, very reasonable, and folks on both sides of the aisle, as well as millions of outdoorsmen, either represented by these organizations or individually, have said, please make these changes to make sure we can have these reasonable revisions to the law represented in the SHARE Act. Let me speak a little bit about elephant ivory. We talk about making sure that we are stopping the poaching of elephants, and I can tell you that we are all fully in favor of that. But what this provision does, in the way the ban on ivory trade is to be instituted, would then make it illegal for a grandmother that happens to have a family heirloom in her house that has some ivory in it from giving that to a family member. I mean, that's not what the purpose of this is. Also, many African nations are managing their elephant herds by controlled harvest. So what do? Hunters pay a significant amount of money to go there to harvest those elements. It's done legally. And for them to be able to import that ivory back in the United States has nothing to do with poaching, is actually a sustainable part of maintaining those elephant populations. If we stop that, and we stop now the hunters that will go because they can't bring the ivory back, then are we really doing the right thing for those elephant herds? Are we really creating a sustainable economy there? Because if we take that economy away, what's going to take its place? Poaching will take its place. So to do this within a legal framework, to make sure that folks can continue to harvest these elements, bring the ivory back legally, to make sure two people that have ivory already, that legally have that ivory, are now going to be restricted from being able to move that ivory anywhere. In fact, if you take the law to its extreme, they could actually be found in violation of possessing that ivory if they don't have something that they can clearly demonstrate that they prior to the law have purchased it or owned it prior to that. And for many folks, they don't. It's a family heirloom. So where do you go back and say, oh, I can prove that I own this prior to the ban on the sale of ivory? So I think there are many things that are problematic. Our bill seeks to clarify those things to make sure that people that have ivory today can continue to legally possess it, and that those that legally harvest elephants as part of a managed effort in those African nations can actually bring that ivory back. So those are my thoughts about some of the objections to
I
the
think you
legislation.
do make a very good point on the ivory. I've never hunted elephants, but I have friends that have. And that's one of the first things they'll tell you is, number one, it's a pretty expensive enterprise
Yes.
to engage in. Number two, how much the local communities literally depend on it. And if they don't have that business, you will see more poaching and a much more rapid decline in those kinds of areas of the population. So it's a concern. I want to give my friend from Michigan, obviously, an opportunity to respond to anything she cares to.
Well, I do want to respond on the ivory, because I actually received a call from the head of the, Ron Kagan, who's CEO of the Detroit Zoo, who feels very emotional on this. And he said to me that the poaching of elephants in Africa continues to be a crisis, that between 2010 and 2012, 100,000 elephants were illegally killed for their ivory, which is one every 15 minutes. And with all due respect, and we do agree on so much of this, it's really what's missing in this bill that if we could even get some of the amendments made in order, we could make this bill better. But staying on the ivory, what the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed new regulations that would require the sellers of ivory to demonstrate that their items qualify for exemption, and that they do have in that rule a de minimis rule, so that if it has under 200 grams, so if that family member that had the ivory piece, they would be exempt. And so that they tried to take that into account. And my problem with the way that this is written in the bill is that it would not allow the secretary to make any finding that this has been illegally traded. And it is a crisis still. I mean, we do need to worry about it. As I did say, what I'm very worried about is what's not in this bill. The Land and Water Conservation Fund, which I have to admit is one of the bills that I feel the most passionately about. We need to renew for the longer term. That's not done in here. I've talked to quietly all of our friends who are very concerned that the North American Wetlands Conservation Act is not included. That's what my amendment would actually address. And that's critical to many of to these wetlands across the country. So I'm as concerned about what's not in there as well as the ivory provision.
One last question to you both. I've received quite a bit of contact in my office from different sporting groups and that are in favor. Are you aware of anybody opposed that's a sporting group?
Mr. Chairman, we haven't heard of anyone. In fact, if you look at some of the reasons why we didn't include some of these other larger bills in the context of their provisions in critical nature of what it means to sportsmen, like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, like the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, is those are major pieces of legislation and reauthorization that I think deserve their own time to be debated, to make sure we get those right, instead of clumping them all into a giant piece of legislation. And that's what people outside of here get mad at. I said, how do you put all these different pieces together? And I think we're both as passionate about getting those passed, but let's make sure we have the proper debate to do that. So it's not, I think, a reflection of any opposition to that. It's making sure that we do that in the right way, since these are major pieces of legislation. And if we want to do that in the right way and get it right over the long term, to take those up individually. And I can tell you, I'm as committed as anybody else in the committee to make sure that those bills do get taken up individually. But we haven't heard of any opposition from any of the outside groups, I've heard from a few individuals that have had issues, but haven't been opposed to the overall bill, have had some comments on the provisions in the bill.
So if we might, we can provide the committee with a list of 100 conservation groups that are opposed to this, including the League of Conservation Voters, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and a number of other groups that we both respect. And I would say that I agree with it. We need to be given consideration, but this bill is a very good vehicle. And if you just take the North American, the Northlands bill, it expired 2 years ago. We knew these bills that are really critical for preserving our wildlife space. So that's why I'm pushing so hard for it. And it shouldn't have been so hard to have had the Land and Water Conservation Act renewed. And as you know, it too expired. We renewed it for 3 years in the omnibus, but it's a bill how many bills do you know that touch every county in the country, and all of the communities are benefiting for it, and people on both sides support?
Well, thank you both for your testimony. Mr. Woodall?